So, I've been following recently the latest developments in Ukraine for the past 2 weeks, and one current development that really stood out to me is just what happened in Russia's Kursk region. A cross border raid meant to shake things up, hit Russian defenses, disrupt logistics, force Moscow to react. But instead of a strategic win, it turned into a complete disaster for Ukraine. No current breakthroughs, no big PR victory, full retreat, and a lot of wasted manpower. So, what exactly went wrong, and what does that actually tell us about Ukraine's current position in the war? Well, Ukraine has launched a few cross border raids before, but this one stood out. It wasn't just symbolic, it aimed to pressure Russia directly. The problem here? Moscow either expected it or adapted fast. Instead of forcing Russia to shift troops, Ukraine hit fortified defenses and took heavy losses. Worse, the PR angle collapsed. Was this a miscalculation, or does it expose deeper problems? And that's where we will start, with the actual objectives. What was Ukraine trying to accomplish here, and why did it fail so spectacularly? The first key point: failed strategic objectives. On paper, this operation likely had three main goals: disrupt Russian supply lines, force Moscow to reposition troops, and show that Ukraine could still take the fight across the border. But the real strategy may have been more calculated, using captured land as a bargaining chip for negotiations, and creating a distraction while targeting the Kursk nuclear power plant. None of these objectives were achieved. First, the logistics disruption angle. If this was meant to cut Russian supply lines, there's no evidence that it worked. Moscow's military operations didn't slow down, not one bit, and their forces kept up their usual pace. Then there's the idea of drawing Russian troops away from the other front lines. That also didn't happen. Russia barely needed to adjust its troops placements because the incursion was contained so quickly that the attempt to showcase strength also backfired. A failed raid doesn't make Russia look weak, it does the exact opposite, reinforcing Moscow's control over its border regions and stabilizing and pushing back the enemy. The bigger issue here is the strategic miscalculation. If Ukraine's goal was to force Russia to react, but Russia barely had to do anything to shut it down, it highlights the limitations of Ukraine's current military approach. The failure to gain leverage through captured land or disrupt Russian defenses means the operation ultimately achieved nothing. So that raises a big question here. Was this a case of bad execution, or was the whole idea flawed from the start? Because if Ukraine's goal was to force Russia to react, but Russia barely had to do anything to shut it down, what does that say about Ukraine's current military approach? Now, to me, in all honesty, the Ukrainians were expecting a full divergence of Russian forces from the southeastern front lines, thinking they would be able to shift everything up to the Kursk region. And they really thought that that would actually happen, which, sure, you could argue makes some, logical sense, but they completely miscalculated here for sure. The main goal of the Kursk invasion was a nuclear power plant. That was the key target for securing some kind of strategic leverage in the negotiations that were to happen, if at all. And I mean, it makes sense when you think about it. Russia already controls the largest nuclear power plant in Ukraine, so Ukraine probably figured they could do the same. Now, I do want to give Ukraine credit for the idea behind this move in Kursk back in August of 2024, but no thanks to their Western advisors who, let's be real, didn't bother studying history, especially what happened in Kursk in 1943. The whole thing was flawed from the start, and it just completely detached from reality in terms of what they were trying to accomplish with that kind of military operation. Even if, for whatever reason, this plan had actually worked, it wouldn't have achieved anything in the Donbass region. Russia couldn't care. But if, and that's a big if, the Kursk nuclear power plant had somehow been captured by the Ukrainian forces, then maybe, and I emphasize the word maybe, Russia would have shifted more troops than they already did. Other than that, I don't see this incursion into Kursk as anything more than a PR stunt that ultimately failed. You know what? Before I move on, this actually reminds me of the Great Summer 2023 counteroffensive. I mentioned this in one of my earlier videos, how it was hyped up to be something huge, only for it not to achieve a single one of its main objectives. And honestly, we're looking at the same thing here, which is not surprising to me, nor should it be to you. And speaking of Ukraine's strategy, let's talk about the PR side of things. Because usually, even when the operation fails militarily, Ukraine finds a way to control the narrative. But this time, not so much. Key point number 2, failed PR for its incursion into the Kursk region. So far in this war, Ukraine has been incredibly effective in shaping a narrative of the war, largely thanks to the United States and Great Britain out of all the Western countries. Most of its past operations, successful or not, have been framed in a way that keeps Western support strong. This time, the PR campaign started off very well, painting the raid as a bold move to put pressure on Russia. And it initially worked. Media coverage highlighted Ukraine's ability to strike across the border. But as the operation failed to achieve its objectives, the narrative quickly collapsed. Unlike previous cross border raids that dominated the headlines, this one faded very fast. The reason? There was no lasting success story to sell. While Ukraine did cause some Russian losses, they weren't significant enough to change the battlefield dynamics overall. Compare that to Ukraine's strike on the Crimean Bridge, which dominated global media at the time. Even smaller drone attacks in Moscow gets amplified by the Western media. But here, no major breakthroughs, no compelling footage of Ukrainian forces advancing, just images of burnt out vehicles, captured soldiers, and failed attacks. Russia seized the narrative, portraying Ukraine as a desperate and ineffective. The Western media, mostly silent about it. When an operation fails this visibly, there's not much to spin from anymore. Which brings up an important question. How much does this hurt Ukraine in the long run? PR isn't just about headlines. It's about maintaining Western support. And if Ukraine stops looking like it's winning, how long before its backers start reconsidering their level of commitment here? Here's my response to the PR and Western backers. Look, based on their track record of funding Ukraine to the bitter end, nothing about this Kursk PR operation would have changed a damn thing. Just take a look at the so-called Great Ukrainian Summer 2023 counteroffensive. It led to nowhere. Did the West actually stop aiding because of that failure? Not at all. So why would they stop now? You gotta remember here, the West has poured too much economic investment into Ukraine to just let Russia waltz in and claim it all. It's not about winning or losing on the battlefield. It's about protecting their own interests, which comes first to them. However, I will give them credit where it's due. Ukraine pulled off a solid PR campaign for both their own people and the Western audience, no doubt. They executed it brilliantly. For those who eat up the Western narrative through the images and the videos coming from Ukrainian forces moving into Kursk was exactly what they wanted to see and hear. Also, interestingly, there was even a prominent YouTuber with over 1 million subs who actually went to the occupied city of Suduza, or near it, when it was under Ukrainian control, showcasing their early success. Ukraine nailed the PR game at the start of this Kursk incursion and even in the beginning of the war. But in the past few weeks, Russia was able to flip the script on them. They ran another pipe operation around Ukraine, retaking most of the city and the surrounding areas, and forced the Ukrainians into a massive retreat, kind of like a Mario and Luigi move. But hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And here's the key difference. Russia is very slow when it comes to PR, sure. But when it comes to actually warfighting, PR doesn't win battles. That's why Russia doesn't care so much about the propaganda game being played, except for making sure civilians aren't harmed, of course. Other than that, they're focused on the war itself. Meanwhile, Ukraine seems to think posting TikTok videos is the same as winning, which is not. Just to be clear with you all. So, PR failures are one thing, losing troops is another. And that's where this really starts to look terrible for Ukraine. Because Ukraine can't afford to waste manpower like this at all. Key point number 3. Wasted manpower. Manpower is one of Ukraine's biggest challenges currently. Recruitment is struggling, conscription efforts are being more aggressive, and battlefield losses are mounting. Estimates suggest Ukraine has lost between 60,000 to 70,000 troops, and every failed operation adds to that toll. This wasn't just any group of soldiers. Raids like this rely on experienced personnel, like special forces or highly trained units, and yes, Western-backed mercenaries. Losing them isn't just a setback. It depletes Ukraine's already limited pool of skilled fighters. Unlike Russia, which can absorb heavy losses with its larger population, Ukraine doesn't have that luxury. Every lost soldier weakens its defense lines, reduces combat effectiveness, and forces Ukraine to rely on less trained recruits. So, was this risk really worth it in the end, given the losses and the lack of strategic gains? It's hard to argue that Ukraine benefited in any way. So, the facts that I'm going to present to you is this: Ukraine has burned through almost as many troops as they lost in the failed 2023 summer counteroffensive, estimated at around 100,000 troops. For comparison, the Battle of Kursk saw about 70,000 Ukrainian losses when stacked against Russia's. You would think that they would have learned by now when it comes to these kind of military operations, but apparently not. Go figure. Now, what's actually disturbing here is that currently the Ukrainian government is now resorting to outright abducting more men against their will, just to keep BlackRock happy, unfortunately. And in that process, they're only making the situation worse by sending more untrained troops to the front lines, instead of actually reinforcing what little ground they still hold. I've already said this before, especially in my video on the topic of Kursk, that Ukraine should be more conservative with their strategies, and this Kursk incursion proves my point. The border raids have been running, both recently and in the past, don't seem to be hitting anything strategically valuable. They're just distractions, if we're being honest here. At the end of the day, Ukraine looks like it's in full desperation mode, with a lot of tactical missteps, mostly following whatever their Western backers tell them to do. If they really want to hold longer, the actual smart move here would be to completely ignore all Western military advice. Just my opinion, though. And that brings us to the final part. What happens now? Because after every failed operation, there's always a response. The question is, who benefits from what comes next? Key point number 4, the aftermath and what comes next. So where does this leave Ukraine? Well, first, Russia's going to use this justification for escalating attacks. Moscow has already been ramping up its strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure, and this just gives them another excuse to go harder than before. Second, Ukraine's credibility, both militarily and politically, takes a massive hit. The failure won't be ignored by its Western allies, especially the ones who are already hesitant about sending more aid and are encouraging for more peaceful negotiations. Every time Ukraine looks less effective on the battlefield, it becomes harder to justify continued support. So what's the bigger picture here? Does this failure change Ukraine's approach? Will it keep attempting these kinds of cross-border operations, hoping for a win? Or will it shift focus, conserving resources for when it actually launches a more decisive offensive? And of course, there's the underlying question no one in Kiev wants to answer. Does this bring Ukraine any closer to considering negotiations? Because at some point, piling up failures like this forces a country to rethink its own options. Well, here's the deal with this last key point. Ukraine, based on everything we've seen so far, is going to double down and continually keep pushing for these reckless raids and incursions that, let's be honest here, won't bring them anywhere near close to victory. Not even remotely. The only real thing keeping them afloat is Western support, and that's purely because of how much money and resources they have already been sunk into this conflict. Now, unless Russia somehow decides to take all of Ukraine up to the Polish border, which I frankly think they won't even do, Ukraine is going to be stuck in this cycle. And as for the Kursk incursion, it's going to go down as a military disaster, plain and simple. Just like what happened with the Germans back in 1943. As they say, history repeats itself, folks, unfortunately. Lastly, this is going to change how the war moves forward now. The front lines in the southeastern Donbass could start collapsing at a faster rate, maybe even leading to a broader shift, as some armchair analysts have thrown the idea around. And hey, maybe they got a point. We'll see. So, to wrap up my final thoughts here, there's a lot to be said. First of all, Ukraine really needs to stop doing these cross-border raids, especially now going into the Volgograd region, which, again, if they haven't learned from the Kursk incursions, they need to understand that this is not going to end well at all. Secondly, you're now seeing more Russian advances on the front lines. Russia's actually closing in on Kupiansk and even going past Chasiv Yar and many other places too. Maybe even close to Pavlovsk in terms of actually moving to basically get that city. And again, as I mentioned, it's very disturbing how Ukraine wants to sacrifice all this men just for PR, which again, they're doing that so that way the Western backers can showcase to us, the Western citizens, hey, look, look at these poor Ukrainians. They're suffering, they're getting destroyed. We need to take your money to send it to them, even though we don't know where that money is going. And the weapons as well, mind you, which exactly proves my point here. Ukraine isn't in any position to continue doing these PR campaigns, even though the Western narrative, unfortunately for them, is shifting back to an actual centrist position, or maybe even a better realistic position where basically everyone is telling Ukraine, stop this nonsense, talk with Russia. Though, again, they're not going to do that because in their constitution, which they have signed in 2022, they literally state that they can never negotiate with Russia, which puts them basically behind a wall where they're trapped, or rock in a hard place to be more correct on that simplification or analogy. End of the day, this raid was supposed to make a statement. Instead, it literally turned into a case study in what not to do. No strategic gains at all, no PR win, well, initially, yes, but later on, no. And unnecessary losses that, unfortunately, Ukraine is still suffering trying to get out of Kursk. And there is rumors that there's about 2,000 to maybe 7,000 trapped Ukrainians, which I don't even know about, but keep that in mind if you decide to believe it or not. Ukraine is also already in a tough position as it is, and setbacks like this is only going to make it harder for them. Now, the big question is, how many more failures like this can Ukraine actually afford before the war's momentum shifts completely? Otherwise, guys, just leave very interesting comments that I would be more than happy to read and respond to because, again, I love those comments. And if you can deliver that engagement, I'd greatly appreciate that. You don't have to, but again, if you do, greatly appreciate that. Otherwise, take care, guys. Bye.